You think you can sit there and mock a man's life work, Kimmel? You're nothing but a loudmouth with a cheap suit and cheaper jokes." Clint Eastwood's voice thundered across the studio, his eyes narrowing like a gunslinger sizing up a target. The audience gasped, frozen in their seats, as the legendary actor and director leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Jimmy Kimmel, usually quick with a quip, faltered, his smirk twitching under the weight of Eastwood's glare. The air crackled with hostility, a showdown brewing on live television. What had started as a routine interview was spiraling into a clash of egos, rooted in a betrayal that cut deeper than any script Eastwood had ever read. This wasn't about fame or Hollywood glitz. It was personal, raw, and ready to explode. The trouble began weeks earlier when Kimmel's show aired, a segment poking fun at Eastwood's latest film, a gritty western about a retired rancher seeking justice for his murdered son. The movie was a passion project, one Eastwood poured his heart into, inspired by his own father's struggles as a working-class man. Kimmel's bit, however, called it a dusty snooze fest and mocked Eastwood's age, complete with a skit featuring a doddering impersonator stumbling through a saloon. The audience laughed then, but Eastwood didn't. He'd agreed to appear on the show to promote the film, expecting a fair shake. Instead, he walked into a trap. Kimmel, sensing a chance to boost ratings, had planned to revisit the skit live, thinking it'd be a harmless jab. He didn't count on Eastwood's fury. As the cameras rolled, Kimmel leaned back in his chair, flashing that boyish grin that usually charmed guests into submission. "So, Clint, loved the new movie, but did you mean for it to feel like it was, shot in 1880? The audience chuckled, but Eastwood's jaw tightened. He'd heard the whispers about his age, his relevance, but to have his work ridiculed on national television by a man who'd never known a day's real struggle was a slap he wouldn't take. "You got a problem with my film, you say it. To my face, not in some coward skit," Eastwood shot back, his voice low but venomous. The crowd hushed, sensing the shift. Kimmel, caught off guard, tried to pivot. "Come on, Clint, it's just comedy. You're a legend, you can take a joke." But Eastwood wasn't laughing. He leaned closer, his stare cutting through Kimmel's bravado. "A joke's only funny if it's got truth. You wouldn't know truth if it bit you." The tension thickened as Kimmel, desperate to regain control, doubled down. "Truth? Okay, let's talk truth. Your movie's got heart, sure, but it's slow. People want action, not a lecture on life from Grandpa." The audience gasped, some booing, but Kimmel waved them off, his confidence bordering on arrogance. Eastwood's eyes flashed with something dangerous, a spark of the man who'd stared down villains in countless films. He stood, towering over the desk, his voice steady but laced with rage. "You think you're clever, don't you? Mocking a story about a man's loss, his fight to make things right. You ever lost someone, Kimmel? Ever had to claw your way through pain to keep going?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Kimmel's face reddened. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The audience was riveted, the silence deafening. Eastwood's words weren't just about the movie anymore. They carried the weight of his life, decades of hard-won battles, from scraping by as a young actor to building a legacy through sheer grit. Kimmel's mockery wasn't just an insult to his film. It was a jab at every sacrifice, every late night, spent perfecting a scene, every moment he'd channeled his own grief into art. The studio felt smaller, the air heavier as the two men locked eyes. Kimmel, sensing the moment slipping, tried to pivot again, this time with a patronizing tone. "Clint, relax. It's just showbiz. Nobody's attacking your life story." But Eastwood wasn't buying it. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "You don't get to tear down what I built just to fill your airtime. You want a fight? You got one." The audience erupted, some cheering, others stunned, as Eastwood turned, ready to walk off. Kimmel, panicked, called after him. But the damage was done. This was no longer an interview. It was war. Eastwood's boots hit the studio floor with a deliberate thud, each step echoing like a warning shot. He was halfway to the stage exit, his broad shoulders rigid with fury, when Kimmel's voice cut through the charged silence. "Come on, Clint, don't be so sensitive. You're walking out over a little ribbing?" The host's tone dripped with condescension, a desperate attempt to paint Eastwood as the unreasonable one. The audience stirred, some murmuring in support of Eastwood, others egging Kimmel on for the drama. But Eastwood stopped, his back still to the desk, and the room held its breath. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Kimmel with a cold intensity that made the host shift in his seat. "Sensitive?" Eastwood growled, his voice like gravel. "You think this is about my feelings? You disrespected my work, my family's story for a cheap laugh. That's not comedy. That's cowardice." Kimmel's face twisted, his charm crumbling under the accusation. He leaned forward, jabbing a finger toward Eastwood. "Cowardice? I'm doing my job, old man. This show's about entertaining people, not stroking your ego." The crowd gasped at the insult, but Kimmel barreled on, his voice rising. "Your movie's a relic, Clint. Nobody cares about your sad cowboy stories anymore. Wake up, the world's moved on." The words were a calculated jab, meant to provoke, and they hit their mark. Eastwood's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles whitening. He took a step back toward the desk, his presence commanding despite his age. "Moved on?" he said, his voice steady but laced with contempt. "You think entertaining means tearing down what others build? You're not an entertainer, you're a vulture." The audience erupted, some cheering Eastwood's defiance, others shouting for Kimmel to fire back. The host, rattled but refusing to back down, stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "A vulture? That's rich coming from a guy who's been milking the same tough guy act for 50 years. Kimmel's words were sharp, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. He'd underestimated Eastwood, expecting the legend to roll over like so many guests before him. Instead, he was facing a man who'd faced down worse than a smug talk show host and come out on top every time. Eastwood stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You want to talk acts? Let's talk yours. Hiding behind jokes, picking on folks who've earned their place, while you sit there grinning like a snake oil salesman." The crowd roared, the energy in the room electric. Kimmel, now visibly flustered, tried to pivot to the audience for support. "Folks, can you believe this guy? He comes on my show and can't handle a little fun." But the tactic backfired. Boos rained down, mixed with chants of, "Clint! Clint!" The audience wasn't buying Kimmel's act anymore. They saw through his polished veneer to the man, who'd crossed a line, mocking not just a film but a legacy forged through decades of sweat and sacrifice. Eastwood, sensing the shift, didn't let up. "You want fun? Try earning respect instead of demanding it. You think you can sit there and judge me? I fought for everything I've got." "What have you fought for, Kimmel? Ratings?" The question landed like a punch, and for a moment Kimmel was speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The audience's cheers grew louder, fueling Eastwood's momentum. He wasn't just defending his movie now. He was defending every hard-working person who'd ever been belittled by someone too comfortable to understand real struggle. Kimmel, desperate to reclaim the narrative, leaned into the microphone. "You're out of touch, Clint. You're living in the past, and nobody wants to hear it." But Eastwood was done listening. He turned again, this time with purpose, his steps steady as he headed for the exit. "I don't need your stage to be heard," he said over his shoulder, his voice carrying the weight of finality. The crowd was on its feet, some clapping, others shouting encouragement, as Kimmel stood frozen, realizing too late he'd picked a fight he couldn't win. The studio doors loomed closer as Clint Eastwood's steady strides carried him toward freedom from Kimmel's smug arena. The audience's cheers swelled behind him, a wave of support that drowned out the host's faltering attempts to regain control. But Kimmel wasn't done. His voice cracked through the microphone, sharp and biting, like a man grasping at the last threads of his authority. "Go ahead, Clint, run away. You can't handle the truth about your washed-up career." The words were a low blow, meant to sting, and they did. Eastwood froze, one hand on the exit door, his shoulders tensing like a coiled spring. The crowd hushed, sensing the storm about to break. He turned, his face a mask of controlled rage, and the room felt smaller, the air thick with anticipation. "You call that truth?" Eastwood's voice was a low rumble, each word deliberate, cutting through Kimmel's bravado like a blade. He stepped back toward the stage, his eyes never leaving the host's. "Truth is getting up every day, working till your bones ache, building something real. You wouldn't know that. You just tear down what others make." The audience roared, their applause shaking the studio. Kimmel's face flushed, his hands gripping the desk as he scrambled for a comeback. "Oh, please," he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Spare us the sermon, preacher. Your movies are for old folks who can't let go of the past." The insult was desperate, a flailing attempt to claw back the crowd, but it only fueled their anger. Shouts of "Shame on you" and "Respect Clint" erupted from the seats. Eastwood didn't flinch. He closed the distance to the desk, standing tall, his presence towering despite the years etched into his frame. "Old folks," he said, his tone icy. "Those are the people who built this country, who fought for it, who earned every scar. You mock them, you mock me, you mock everything that matters." His words hit like a hammer, each one landing with the weight of a man who'd lived through hardship Kimmel could only imagine. The host, cornered, tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow. "You're making this too serious, Clint. It's just a show," he said, his voice cracking under the pressure. Eastwood shook his head, a faint, bitter smile crossing his lips. "That's your problem, Kimmel. You think everything's a game. Some things are worth fighting for." The crowd was on its feet now, their cheers a tidal wave of support for Eastwood. A woman in the front row, her face lined with age, shouted, "Tell him, Clint!" Her voice carried the same fire as Eastwood's, a reminder that this wasn't just about a movie. It was about respect, about honoring the struggles of those who came before. Kimmel, sensing the tide turning against him, tried one last jab. "You're a legend, sure, but legends fade. Nobody's watching your stuff anymore." The lie was blatant and the audience wasn't having it. Boos thundered through the studio loud enough to rattle the cameras. Eastwood's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're wrong. People watch because they feel something real. They don't need your fake laughs to tell them what's good." Kimmel's mask slipped, his smirk gone, replaced by a flash of panic. He'd pushed too far, and now he was alone, the crowd firmly in Eastwood's corner. The director leaned in, his voice steady but searing. "You want to know why I'm leaving? It's not because I can't take a joke. It's because I don't waste my time with people who don't respect what's true." The audience exploded, their applause a deafening roar as Eastwood turned again, this time with a finality that left no room for argument. Kimmel, desperate, shouted after him, "You'll regret this, Clint. You need this show." But the words fell flat, swallowed by the crowd's fervor. Eastwood didn't look back. He pushed through the exit door, leaving Kimmel stranded in the wreckage of his own making, the audience's cheers echoing in his wake. The heavy studio door slammed shut behind Clint Eastwood, the sound reverberating like a gavel in a courtroom. Outside, the cool night air hit his face, but his blood still boiled from Kimmel's insults. Inside, the audience's cheers lingered, a roaring testament to the stand he'd taken. He didn't need to look back to know Kimmel was scrambling, his polished facade cracked beyond repair. Eastwood's truck waited in the lot, a beat-up relic from his ranching days, as much a part of him as the films he'd made. He climbed in, the engine growling to life. But before he could pull away, a young stagehand, barely out of his teens, ran up, breathless. "Mr. Eastwood, that was incredible. You showed him." The kid's eyes shone with admiration, and Eastwood gave a nod, a flicker of warmth breaking through his anger. "Thanks, son. Some fights you don't walk away from." Back in the studio, Kimmel sat at his desk, the cameras still rolling, his face a mix of shock and forced bravado. The audience's applause for Eastwood hadn't died down, and their boos now turned on him, sharp and unrelenting. All right, settle down," Kimmel said, his voice thin, trying to wave off the hostility. "Let's move on to the next segment." But the crowd wasn't listening. A man in the back shouted, "You crossed a line, Jimmy!" Others joined in, their voices a chorus of disapproval. Kimmel's smile faltered, his hands fidgeting with a pen. He'd built his career on sharp wit and quick jabs, but tonight he'd aimed at the wrong man and missed. "Come on, folks, it's just entertainment," he tried again, but the words sounded hollow, like a plea for mercy he didn't deserve. The show cut to commercial, but the damage was done. Backstage, producers whispered frantically, knowing the clip of Eastwood's exit was already spreading like wildfire. Kimmel, alone at his desk during the break, stared at the empty stage where Eastwood had stood. He'd thought he could outsmart a legend, use him for a laugh to boost ratings. Instead, he'd been schooled, his arrogance laid bare for millions to see. He muttered to a nearby assistant, "He's just an old guy. Why's everyone acting like he's a hero?" The assistant, shaking his head, replied, "Because he is, Jimmy. You picked a fight with the wrong man." Kimmel's jaw tightened, but he had no comeback. The truth stung worse than Eastwood's words. Meanwhile, Eastwood drove through the city, the lights blurring past as he headed home. His mind wasn't on Kimmel anymore, but on the people who'd cheered, the ones who understood what his film meant. A story of loss, grit, and standing tall no matter the odds. He thought of his father, the real-life rancher whose struggles inspired the movie, and the countless others like him, working folks who never got a spotlight but kept going. Kimmel's mockery hadn't just been about a film, it was an attack on their lives, their values. Eastwood's stand wasn't just for himself, it was for them. By the time he reached his ranch, the anger had faded, replaced by a quiet pride. He'd said what needed saying, and the world had heard. The next morning, the story dominated headlines. Clips of Eastwood's fiery words and Kimmel's floundering spread across television and radio, with commentators praising Eastwood's courage and slamming Kimmel's disrespect. Fans flooded Eastwood's mailbox with letters, thanking him for defending not just his work, but the dignity of those who'd been belittled. Kimmel's show took a hit, his audience numbers dipping as viewers turned away, tired of his smug jabs. Eastwood, meanwhile, returned to his ranch, already planning his next project. He didn't need Kimmel's stage or anyone's approval. He'd walked away not as a defeated man, but as a victor, his legacy stronger than ever. The fight was over, and Clint Eastwood had won. Not with fists, but with words that cut deeper than any blade.